Greetings and welcome, I am Sugi JRPG here, and today I am delighted to review Star Ocean The Last Hope 4K and Full HD Remaster for PC. This version is also available on PS4. Now, The Last Hope, also known as Star Ocean 4, takes place first in the timeline of the game series in a chronological order, but what you need to understand is that these Star Ocean games are not exactly like connected to each other. Yeah, they take place in the same universe and sometimes in the same planets, but fundamentally the stories are very isolated from each other and not exactly connected in any way because the timelines are also so drastically different. We're talking about hundreds of years and sometimes thousands of years gap between some of these games. Now, the game follows our main protagonist, Edge Maverick, and also Reimi Sayonji, who are embarking kind of like the first interstellar travel by humans. The Earth has gone through basically World War III, things were left in ruins, and out of the ashes basically rose the greater United Nations, which basically, formed this sort of a space travel thing, and they wanted to basically go into space to find hospitable worlds and possibly another home for humanity. So this is kind of like a Star Trek type of a setting where they're kind of like embarking out of the Earth for the first time and getting to contact with other nations, other planets, and all that type of stuff. So it's kind of like the very beginning story of Star Ocean in a lot of ways, and it's kind of like cool because actually in this game they do travel multitude of different planets. Like, even though the name kind of suggests like a lot of space travel and a very vast universe to explore, a galaxy to explore, in a lot of ways in the other games they barely like visit two other planets. In Star Ocean 3 they do actually visit quite different planets, but fundamentally in other games like they literally take place on a one planet mostly. And that's why The Last Hope has received some like very good feedback, because actually you do visit multitude of different planets out there. And basically Edge and Reimi are, going into this first planet, and well, things kind of go sideways and they are basically left to investigate what happened to another ship on the planet. And then there's like insect monsters and things like that, and one leads to basically another thing, and they go into different planets, and they're gonna have different stories there and different plot lines which may or may not be connected to the actual main story. Now, one of the cool aspects about the characters themselves is that they fundamentally look very different from each other. And we weren't like stuck with, literal teenager humans in space again, like we do with a lot of other JRPG games these days. Like, it's not really about an age question, it's just that when you have like a space adventure, you would expect that, hey, maybe there are characters which are not humanoid or alien characters which are a bit more different from humans. And yes, like a couple of these are more like elf looking like creatures which are very close to humans but not quite. But what I really liked about the Star Ocean cast, I'm not saying that I like all the characters, but at least design wise they fundamentally look very different each other. Like the silhouettes of the characters are fundamentally distinguishable from each other, and I wish that they would have kept out with this type of thing going on into the newer games. But obviously the last two games, I mean the one that is out and Star Ocean 6 that is coming out soon, all have only human characters on the cast. So that was kind of like a bit of a disappointment. And I felt like in JRPG games in general we have seen a lot more borderline, very boring character designs, a lot more human, which don't look like very unique. Well, I wish we go back into that very fantasy-esque type of a character design. But that's enough about the characters, okay. And since we are, going into the character arc here, it's obviously important to mention that this version does come out with the Japanese dub, which is fundamentally superior to the original English dub, which is actually pretty awful. I would maybe say perhaps one of the worst in the JRPG history in terms of the certain characters like Limley, which is absolutely horrible to listen to in the English dub. They really, really missed the nail here. And when the game first came out on Xbox, you obviously didn't have the Japanese dub there. So fundamentally, a lot of people experience that very, very horrible dub. So at least with the 4K release, you have the opportunity to actually listen to the Japanese dub, which does usually 90% of the time always do a better job than the English one, because a lot of things are always lost in translation. Some things, you know, turn out to be a lot more childish sounding and things like that. But, you know, the Japanese kind of brings more seriousness to the plot, so to speak. Now, let's talk about a bit of the combat, which is probably the best part about the game. And for a game that came out back in 2009 for Xbox 360 and 2010 for PS3, it has aged pretty well, okay? It's like a very much an improvement on the Star Ocean 3 in terms of like bigger field and a lot more fluid type of a control, like side dashing. It does, you know, it dropped out the whole heavy and, you know, light attack type of a thing, and perhaps moved more towards to like, you know, chaining skills and, you know, casting abilities. But fundamentally, I thought the combat was probably the most highlighted things about this game. Maybe towards the end, the bosses just have too much health and it just becomes more like spamming heal and attacking all the time. But, you know, I would argue that this is actually like a very, very good action RPG style of a combat, which is like even better than some of the like modern Tales games in certain aspects. So I think that this has aged like really, really well in terms of combat. And I would argue that Star Ocean's really improved like every title. I mean, remember that Star Ocean 5 also has a pretty good combat, in a lot of ways actually better than in Star Ocean 4. Now, there aren't really like many big mini games in Star Ocean 4 except the bunny racing, which is basically just very simple derpy racing, which doesn't even let you like control the bunny. You can just like spam the speed boost or the stun attack. So you have like an energy bar and you can choose whatever to do, a speed boost or a stun attack, which basically paralyzes the opponents for a while so you can move. And there are like a couple of different tiers and difficulties to these, but this is like a very automated experience. And I tried it, you know, for the sake of the review, but like I just didn't really find this like that interesting. I mean, most of the minigame stuff is basically like just side quests, which are like delivery quests and things like that. And the bunny racing is indeed actually tied into the coliseum, where you can win like these tickets by defeating different enemies, and you can like go into these battles with like a party or with a single character. So you kind of have the option to play with all of the characters. And what is kind of nice about the game is that even the support type of like characters do have offensive abilities, so you can basically go through the solo route with any character you basically desire in the party. So that's actually pretty good. And the Coliseum basically gets you these tickets, which you can basically then use on the bunny racing. And also these tickets can be then later redeemed into like specialized items and weapons, basically, which might have a lot of value down the line. And then there's obviously the crafting system. I don't know, did this actually exist in Star Ocean 1 and 2? I do remember it in the third game, which wasn't really fun to use at all. I'm still in the middle of playing that game through, and that will be reviewed probably soon. But this crafting system is like, all the characters have like some innate ability, which is like collecting treasure chests or harvesting plants or mining. These basically can be used like alchemy to craft different types of items, whether it's equipment, quest items, swords, armors, and things like that. And basically you do different type of combinations, and they will basically span out different types of items depending on their, you know, levels for alchemy or harvesting or mining and etc. So it's like an okay system, but the problem is that you have to harvest these items and you don't necessarily know at which harvest spot yields this item. You have to literally go into the internet and like Google out, okay, this is where I can get this item, this vendor sells out this item. So like actually completing the recipes is kind of problematic in the game. I really recommend not selling any item whatsoever in the game, because they will be required in some delivery quests, or they might be needed in some, you know, recipe later down the game. And there are certain locations which you can never return to after you are first time visiting those places. So there are some quests which you're not able to complete if you don't do them on the actual right given amount of, you know, arc that you're residing in certain planets. So that's something you really want to think about. And also the game doesn't tell you exactly like when those quests are going to be expiring, so you're going to be probably doing that on your second playthrough or something. Now, in terms of the graphics, the 4K HD remaster does look very good still. I mean, it kind of reminds me of playing the Final Fantasy 13 on PC, and I like realized like these games came out roughly on the same time, and they still look pretty great on the modern standards. I mean, they're not on the exact highest graphics obviously compared to modern games, but they're still like obviously JRPG fans perhaps have a bit more lower standards when it comes to graphics. We are probably interested more in the the story and the combat. So graphics never has been the main selling point of a lot of JRPGs, in my opinion. That is, I mean, for their time they were great, but I think these JRPG games tend to age a lot better compared to a lot of other games. So the 4K HD remaster turns off like makes the game look very good, and it could be something that literally came out like 2 years ago or 5 years ago, and there is some lacking in the adjustments in the graphics. Like I can't exactly choose the windowed mode, how big of the screen will be, and a couple of like small things like that. But I didn't really witness any frame drop issues. I had a problem with the game crashing on the last door, which takes you to the last boss, but I reinstalled the game and that basically fixed out that problem altogether. So that was pretty good. So in terms of the port, I would argue that it's pretty good. Obviously there's always going to be people whining about the problems, but they usually have just like wooden PCs, so that's granted. But fundamentally this is a very good port. Now in terms of the soundtrack, I thought it was okay. Just like a lot of JRPGs, they managed to do a good combat tracks for the bosses and things like that, but sometimes like the town or other dungeons tend not to have like anything very good. I really like the last dungeons track though, but this is not a soundtrack I would go listen to outside of the game itself. So I would argue that Star Ocean 3 had fundamentally a lot better soundtrack than The Last Hope, but it does its job. I'm not really complaining, but it's not a masterpiece by any stretch of imagination. So let's kind of delve into the main story by going into a bit of the spoiler territory here. So a bit of a warning here, not going into like major plot twists here, but some criticism about the story, because that's probably the biggest thing you have to talk about regarding The Last Hope. So the story of the game kind of low-key jumps around, since we kind of visit certain planets that aren't exactly super tied into the main plot. And some of these planets may exist just purely to introduce one of the characters into the cast, okay? Like the alternative Earth, which is just there to basically build out a background story for one of these characters, basically. But, yeah, so the pacing is good, though. I wouldn't, complain about it. I mean, I obviously, even if, even when people go to traveling into other countries or something, you can't completely plan it out. So you're going to be doing some random stuff that you're going to be seeing street. Oh, there's a cool looking shop there, I go there. So it's kind of like normal when people would go into another planet, they end up doing a bunch of random stuff, which is not exactly tied into the main plot here. And that's kind of fine, because we don't do massive amounts of side railing here. So they are kind of low key tied into, but mostly perhaps tied towards introducing some of the characters into the cast, and then they are then later on perhaps somewhat connected in the main plot of the story. Now the story isn't the strong suit of the game. I think most people would agree with me. It's not exactly horrible, but it has some redeeming qualities about it, and some things that are not done really well. For one, the certain main characters are introduced very late to the game, like Sarah and Arumat. Arumat gets introduced before the last 2 dungeons of the game, so he stays in the party for a least amount of time. And yes, he is he makes a 1 appearance before in the beginning of the game, but he's not part of the party, and he has barely any dialogue. So the fundamental problem of any JRPG game is that you should never introduce a character past halfway of the game. That's really, really bad, because number one, you have to adjust your team composition and possible strategy. I think in Final Fantasy IX, for example, I believe Amaranth is the final character that gets added in, and he gets added in disc 3, I think, and he was one of my favorite characters, so I had to change and level up the, like, this is not a good idea to just introduce characters very late on. But Amaranth is a very different case because he's like built it up, or early on towards the story. But like, you should never like add characters very late on because you can't level them up, find them equipment, and add their SP abilities and chains and everything. So that takes a bit of adjustment period. So in terms of Araminth and Sarah, they were added really late on, and neither of them really had any fundamental character development. Sarah especially has fundamentally no change whatsoever, outside from that secret ending that you may unlock. But yeah, like that's kind of really bad here. So some of the characters get introduced very late. Also, the main villain of the game is very lame. I'm very critical about villains all the time. I think it's a very core component about creating a very good JRPG. You have to build up the villain, you have to show it up kind of early. They kind of do that in the game, but I'm not gonna reveal what's going on here. People who have played the game know exactly who is the main villain, and they kind of like agree with me perhaps that, yeah, okay, that was kind of a silly solution here. And they kind of like try to add this sort of pseudo-intellectual concepts about the main threat in the game and make it like deeper or interesting, but that didn't really get me hooked. I think it was like nonsensical stuff here. Maybe I wasn't like trying enough to pay attention to this grandiose idea that they were trying to build up here, but it's kind of like very deep in science fiction nonsense, in my opinion. Maybe if you did, have a different opinion, I would like to hear it on the comment section below. But in terms of like, running the game, here down, so the overall rundown. So the game was roughly around 45 hours long. You can get really a lot of hours, up to 80 hours or more, by doing the Coliseum, the late game dungeon, and all the other side quests and errands that the game has to offer. And obviously there is kind of like a new game plus there, because you can play the game through on well, not New Game Plus, but you can play the game through on a harder difficulty, and you can make certain collectible things, cross over to the other thing. And there's a lot of like battle trophies you can basically get by achieving certain combos or killing a certain amount of enemies in the battle. There are a lot of these types of like things you can do in the game, and obviously there's the crafting side of things. So there are a lot of like side content that you can do, but it's always tends to be like, at least in my experiences, that usually the games that you don't really want to play that much tend to have the most amount of that side content, and then the games you like actually really loved and maybe wanted to do a bit more of that side content tend not to have as much as some other titles do. But I mean, fundamentally, Star Ocean 4 is a decent game. It just has fundamental flaws. It did certain things really well, like we talked about, going into multiple planets. You have a spaceship which you can actually travel to different locations, and that was very refreshing. And also having a cast which was very diverse. I mean, okay, you had a lolly character there, you had a Neko, you had a cyborg, and you had some boob fan service there, and an edgy, darker character like Arumat. But yeah, I mean, certain of those characters I maybe would have cut out fundamentally, but I think, at least all the people probably will find one character that they actually liked in this cast, even though some of them are kind of generic, and they have their tropes and one thing that they kind of keep doing over and over again in terms of the story. And but whatever, I thought Star Ocean The Last Hope was a decent game. It's definitely something worth picking out if it's on like sale or something. I mean, it's only 20 euros on Steam, and the bang for the buck is really actually pretty good. And as I said, it does look pretty good for its age. So there are definitely aspects about this game that are pretty good, but it's probably not the best game in the series. There are aspects about that Star Ocean 5 does really well, and 3 does a lot better than Star Ocean 4, at least what I've seen on my gameplays so far. But in case you are interested in Star Ocean 5, 6, and 3 reviews on the channel, it's better to subscribe now. And obviously other JRPG reviews coming out. Stranger in Paradise should be coming out soon. And let me know what you thought about Last Hope. Is it good or is it bad? What do you think about the story and etc.? Thanks for watching. I will be seeing you in the next JRPG review.